Forget the world you know. Forget neat timelines and the comforting march of progress. We must first journey into shadow, into a myth, the myth of the Dark Ages. 1,000 years of human history dismissed as a meaningless pit of ignorance, between the glories of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. We are told it was an age of nothing, an age of mud and blood and fear, an age where knowledge was forgotten, where progress halted, and where humanity simply waited for the light to return. But what if that is the greatest lie ever told? What if, within that supposed darkness, new worlds were being forged in iron and fire? What if this was not an age of forgetting, but of desperate, brilliant reinvention? An age that gave us the castle and the cathedral, the university and the parliament, the knight and the code of chivalry? Over the next 2 hours, we will pull back the veil on this misunderstood era. We will prove that this was not an empty age, but a crucible. We will meet the barbarian kings who built new kingdoms on Roman dust. We will stand with Charlemagne, the giant who dreamed of a new Roman Empire. We will face the fury of the Vikings, the piety of the Crusaders, the horror of the Black Death, and the genius of the master builders who reached for the heavens with stone and glass. This is the story of how the modern world was truly born. This is the history they don't teach you. As we begin, we have a question for you. What one word comes to your mind when you think of the Middle Ages? Let us know in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe these lost stories deserve to be told, become part of our fellowship by liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. Our story begins now. The end of the Western Roman Empire was not a sudden cataclysm. It was a slow, creeping death, a multi-generational unraveling of the most complex civilization the world had ever known. For a century, the symptoms had been clear to those who dared to look. The empire was suffering from what modern historians call imperial overstretch. Its borders were too long, its enemies too numerous. The tax base was shrinking as vast estates owned by the super-rich became tax-exempt, placing an unbearable burden on the middle-class provincials and small farmers. The economy, heavily reliant on conquest and slave labor, stagnated as the empire ceased to expand. A series of plagues, beginning in the 2nd century, had decimated the population, leading to manpower shortages on farms and in the army. The political heart of the empire was just as sick. The 3rd century crisis had seen dozens of emperors rise and fall in a blur of assassination and civil war, shattering the illusion of stability. The army, once a disciplined force of citizen soldiers, was now largely composed of barbarian mercenaries whose loyalty was often to their paymaster and their general, not to a distant and abstract emperor. The final act in 476, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus, was less of a conquest and more of a quiet coup. Odoacer didn't even claim the imperial title for himself. He simply sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, stating that one emperor was enough for the world. In reality, the West had already fractured. Power was no longer in the hands of senators and bureaucrats, but in the hands of local strongmen, Roman generals, and the leaders of the Germanic peoples who had been settling within the empire's borders. For decades, these were the foederati, barbarian tribes bound by treaty to defend the empire in exchange for land and gold. Now, with the central government gone, they were the masters. They were the heirs of Rome. In Italy, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great established what seemed to be the most promising successor state. Theodoric, who had been raised as a noble hostage in Constantinople, possessed a deep admiration for the civilization he had now conquered. He ruled Italy as a dual kingdom. His Goths were governed by their own laws, while the far more numerous Roman population continued to live under the Roman legal system, with the Senate still meeting in Rome as it had for 1,000 years. He repaired aqueducts, restored public buildings, and promoted a degree of religious tolerance between his Arian Christian Goths and the Catholic Roman population. Yet this delicate balance was built on his personal authority. In his later years, paranoia took hold. He imprisoned and executed the brilliant philosopher Boethius, who wrote his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy, while awaiting his death. After Theodoric died, succession struggles tore his kingdom apart, providing the perfect pretext for the ambitious Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian to launch a devastating invasion to reclaim Italy. The Gothic War lasted for nearly 2 decades and left the Italian peninsula shattered, depopulated, and far more ruined than it had ever been under barbarian rule. Arguably, the most successful and certainly the most enduring of the new kingdoms was forged in the province of Gaul by the Franks. This confederation of Germanic tribes was led by the exceptionally ruthless and brilliant Merovingian king, Clovis. He came to power as a young man, a pagan king ruling a small territory. Through a relentless series of campaigns, he assassinated rival Frankish chieftains, defeated the last Roman general in Gaul, and subjugated other barbarian tribes. But his most decisive move was one of faith and political genius. His wife, Clotilde, was a Catholic Christian, and she urged him to convert. According to legend, facing defeat at the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni, Clovis prayed to the Christian God, promising to be baptized if he was granted victory. The tide of the battle turned, and Clovis kept his word. His conversion to Catholicism, rather than the Arianism of the Goths and Vandals, was a masterstroke. It immediately earned him the loyalty of the Gallo-Roman population and the powerful, land-owning bishops who saw him as a legitimate Orthodox Christian king. This alliance of Frankish military power and Roman ecclesiastical and administrative skill was the bedrock upon which the future nation of France would be built. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths created a sophisticated kingdom centered on their capital of Toledo. Having been pushed out of Gaul by Clovis's Franks, they consolidated their rule in Spain. Like other Germanic rulers, they initially struggled with the division between their Arian faith and their Catholic subjects. This religious tension fueled political instability until King Record converted to Catholicism in 587, unifying the kingdom under one faith. The Visigoths excelled in the field of law. They compiled the Visigothic Code, an extraordinary document that blended Germanic and Roman legal principles, abandoning the barbarian tradition of personal law for one of territorial law that applied to everyone in the kingdom, Goth and Roman alike. This code would influence Spanish jurisprudence for centuries. Despite this, their kingdom was chronically weakened by a tradition of elective monarchy. which encouraged endless plots and assassinations by ambitious nobles vying for the crown. This internal rot would prove fatal when a new, unified force from North Africa landed on their shores in the year 711. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurred across the English Channel. Rome had abandoned Britain in 410, leaving the Romano-Britons to their fate. The island descended into a chaotic period of warring petty kingdoms. Into this void came seafaring peoples from northern Germany and Denmark, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Theirs was not a single coordinated invasion, but a slow, creeping migration and conquest that lasted over a century. They did not seek to rule over the Romano-Britons, but to displace them entirely. The urban culture of Rheman Britain collapsed. Cities like Londinium and Verulamium were abandoned and fell into ruin. The Christian faith was pushed to the western fringes, into Wales and Cornwall, along with the native Britons. In the fertile lowlands of the east, a new pagan society took root, organized into numerous small, warring kingdoms, the Heptarchy. The language of Latin was almost entirely replaced by the Germanic tongue that would become Old English. Meanwhile, the Vandals, in one of the most audacious migrations of the era, crossed from Spain into North Africa, the breadbasket of the old empire. They quickly seized the rich province and its capital, Carthage. Unlike other tribes who respected the Roman system, the Vandals were hostile to the Catholic population and became the first Germanic people to master naval power. From Carthage, they launched pirate fleets that terrorized the Mediterranean, culminating in a devastating sack of Rome in 455 that stripped the city of its remaining wealth. By the dawn of the 6th century, the old world was gone. In its place was a patchwork of hybrid kingdoms, a mosaic of new and old. Barbarian kings wore Roman purple and minted coins with their own faces on them. Germanic war bands formed a new aristocracy, slowly intermarrying with the old Roman senatorial families. Latin was evolving into the new Romance languages, while Roman law was being fused with Germanic custom. The dream of a single, universal empire was dead. In its place was a new, fragmented, and violent reality, a world where loyalty was local and survival was paramount. This was the raw material from which medieval Europe would be built. From the violent, shifting landscape of the early Frankish kingdoms, one family rose to dominate. They did not begin as kings, but as the mayors of the palace, the true power behind the throne of the later Merovingian rulers, who had become little more than ceremonial figureheads. This family, the Carolingians, built their power base through strategic marriages, ruthless ambition, and exceptional military leadership. The most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel, the Hammer. In 732, at the Battle of Tours, he led a Frankish army that defeated a large raiding force from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, while later Christian chroniclers would inflate the battle into a civilization-saving event that single-handedly stopped the tide of Islam. Its immediate effect was to consolidate Charles Martel's authority over the Franks and fill his coffers with plundered wealth. He was king in all but name. His son, Pepin the Short, saw no reason to continue the charade. He sent a letter to Pope Zachary in Rome with a simple, powerful question: who should be king? The one who has the title or the one who has the power? The papacy, threatened by the Lombards in northern Italy and estranged from the Byzantine emperor, desperately needed a powerful military protector north of the Alps. The Pope's answer was clear. In 751, the last Merovingian king was quietly deposed. His long hair, the symbol of his dynasty's power, was shorn, and he was sent to a monastery. Pepin was anointed king of the Franks by the Pope's representative, Boniface. This anointing was a revolutionary act. It wasn't just a coronation. It was a sacred rite that imbued the Carolingian dynasty with divine legitimacy. In return, Pepin marched his army into Italy, defeated the Lombards, and gifted the conquered lands surrounding Rome to the Pope. This donation of Pepin created the Papal States, a territory that would make the popes temporal, political rulers for the next 1,000 years and inextricably link the fate of the Franks with that of the papacy. But the full flowering of Carolingian power came with Pepin's son, Charles, a man so towering in his achievements that history would know him simply as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was a physical giant for his era, well over 6 feet tall, with a piercing gaze and an insatiable, restless energy. He was a paradox, a barbarian warlord who cherished learning, a devout Christian who waged brutal wars of conversion, and a micromanager who personally oversaw everything from the curriculum of his palace school to the sale of eggs on his royal estates. His reign was one of near-constant warfare. For over 45 years, he led his armies on campaign almost every single spring. His greatest and most brutal conflict was a 3-decade war against the pagan Saxons of northern Germany. This was not just a war of conquest, but a holy war of forced conversion. Charlemagne saw the Saxons' paganism as a mortal threat to his Christian kingdom. The conflict was savage, marked by mass deportations, hostage-taking, and infamous atrocities like the massacre of Verdun, where Charlemagne allegedly ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day after a rebellion. He passed laws, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxonia, that made pagan practices such as cremating the dead or refusing baptism capital crimes. He systematically destroyed their sacred groves and idols, seeking to erase their culture and replace it with a Frankish Christian one to the south. He completed his father's work by conquering the Lombard kingdom in Italy, crowning himself king of the Lombards and securing the papacy under his protection. To the east, he annihilated the Avar Khaganate, a nomadic power in modern-day Hungary that had amassed a legendary treasure hoard from decades of raiding Byzantium and the west. The capture of the Avar Ring, their capital, brought so much gold and silver into the Frankish realm that it caused widespread inflation. In the southwest, he pushed into Muslim Spain, seeking to create a defensive buffer zone. An ambush of his rearguard during this campaign in the Pyrenees Mountains, at the Pass of Roncesvalles, would become the subject of the most famous medieval epic poem, The Song of Roland, a story that transformed a military defeat into a heroic tale of Christian martyrdom. By the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne's dominion was vast. He ruled a territory that stretched from the North Sea to central Italy, and from the Atlantic coast of France to the plains of modern-day Austria. It was an empire in all but name, the first great power to unite a significant portion of Western Europe since the fall of Rome. The culmination of this unprecedented power came on Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne was in Rome, having come to restore the authority of Pope Leo III, who had been brutally assaulted by his enemies in the city. During the Christmas Mass at Old St. Peter's Basilica, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo placed an imperial crown on his head. The assembled congregation, likely prompted by the Pope, acclaimed him. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. This moment was electric with symbolism and political meaning. It was a declaration that the Roman Empire in the West was reborn, but as a distinctly Christian and Frankish entity. It was a direct political challenge to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who still considered themselves the one and only true Roman emperor. The coronation established a powerful, if often contentious, ideal that would haunt Europe for 1,000 years. The notion of a unified Christian commonwealth, a Christendom led jointly by a universal emperor and a universal pope. Charlemagne understood, however, that an empire could not be held together by the sword alone. It needed a shared culture, a common administration, and an educated class of priests and officials. This understanding fueled the Carolingian Renaissance. It was not a Renaissance in the Italian sense with a focus on art and humanism, but a deeply practical and religious movement to restore and standardize learning. Charlemagne, though likely only semi-literate himself, was passionately curious. He gathered the greatest minds of his generation to his new capital at Aachen. From England came Alcuin of York, a brilliant scholar who became the architect of the educational reform. He helped establish a palace school and created a standardized curriculum based on the classical Roman model of the 7 liberal arts. This program was then implemented in monasteries and cathedral schools across the empire, with the primary goal of creating a clergy that could read the Bible correctly, and an administration that could read and write the emperor's decrees. Perhaps the most enduring practical innovation of this revival was the script itself. Scribes developed a new form of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule. It was a radical departure from the cramped, abbreviation-filled scripts used previously. With its clear, rounded, and separated letter forms, and its use of both upper and lower case, it was incredibly legible. This clarity revolutionized the copying of books, making it faster, more accurate, and easier to read. The vast majority, over 90% of surviving texts from classical Roman authors like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero exist today only because they were painstakingly copied during this period by Carolingian monks using this new script. In a very real sense, the intellectuals of the Carolingian Renaissance saved the literary heritage of the ancient world from being lost forever. Charlemagne also sought to standardize everything from religious liturgy to currency. He promoted the use of Gregorian chant and the Roman rite for Mass. He issued hundreds of capitularies, detailed decrees that regulated all aspects of life, from military service to the proper management of his own estates, which were expected to serve as models of efficiency. He reformed the monetary system, establishing a solid silver standard, the denarius, that provided a reliable currency for trade. For all its brilliance, the Carolingian Empire was ultimately a personal project, held together by the sheer force of Charlemagne's will and personality. It lacked the robust tax system, standing army, and professional bureaucracy that had allowed the Roman Empire to endure. Its administration depended on the personal loyalty of his counts and dukes, who governed their territories with considerable autonomy. After Charlemagne's death in 814, he was succeeded by his son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a deeply religious man, but lacked his father's overwhelming authority and military prowess. He struggled to keep his ambitious sons in line, and after his death they fell into a destructive civil war. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun officially partitioned the great empire. Charles the Bald took West Francia, the kingdom that would become France. Louis the German took East Francia, the precursor to Germany, and Lothair took the title of emperor and the Middle Kingdom, a long, awkward strip of territory running from the Netherlands down through the Rhineland and into Italy. This Middle Kingdom would be a source of bitter contention between France and Germany for the next 1,000 years. The political unity of Charlemagne's empire was shattered, but its legacy was immense. It had created a potent ideal of a unified Christian Europe. It had saved the wisdom of the ancient world, and it had laid the cultural and political foundations of the great nations that would shape the medieval world. No sooner had the empire of Charlemagne fractured than a new and terrifying threat descended upon the coasts of Europe. From the deep, mist-shrouded fjords and rocky shores of Scandinavia, a storm of warriors and explorers erupted, a force that would instill a new level of fear and chaos into the continent. They were the Northmen, the Norsemen, or as they came to be universally known and feared, the Vikings. For nearly 300 years, from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, the Viking Age would be an era of unparalleled violence, exploration, and cultural exchange that would irrevocably reshape the map and the very soul of Europe. The first raid to be recorded in detail sent a tremor of horror through the Christian world. In 793, Viking longships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, in northern England, and fell upon the holy monastery of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England, a center of learning and immense wealth left completely undefended. The Vikings slaughtered the monks, desecrated the altar, and carried off its treasures of gold, silver, and jeweled gospel books. The scholar Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court, lamented, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." This was not just a raid. It was a profound sacrilege, an assault on God himself in the eyes of Christian Europe. It was a sign of what was to come. But what unleashed this sudden fury from the north? It was not mere barbarism, but a complex cocktail of pressures and opportunities. The Scandinavian homeland was harsh. Arable land was limited, leading to population pressures and intense competition for status and wealth among chieftains or jarls. To be a successful leader, a jarl needed to reward his followers, his herd, with silver and glory, both of which were in short supply at home. The political situation was also a factor. In places like Norway, the consolidation of power under strong kings like Harold Fairhair drove many rival chieftains and their followers to seek new lives and fortunes overseas. Furthermore, the Vikings possessed a revolutionary piece of technology that gave them an almost unfair advantage: the longship This vessel was a masterpiece of naval design. Clinker-built with overlapping planks, it was both incredibly strong and remarkably flexible, able to ride out the fiercest Atlantic storms. Its symmetrical design, with a prow at both ends, allowed it to reverse direction quickly without having to turn around. Most importantly, its shallow draft meant it could not only cross the open ocean, but also penetrate deep into the heart of a continent, sailing up rivers like the Seine, the Rhine, and the Thames to strike at wealthy inland towns and monasteries that had never before known a threat from the sea. They could strike without warning and vanish before a defensive force could be mustered. The Viking expansion followed three main paths. The Norwegians were the great pioneers of the West. They were master navigators who used the sun, stars, and sightings of birds and whales to cross the treacherous North Atlantic. They colonized the sparsely populated Faroe Islands and then Iceland, where they established a unique society governed by the Althing, the oldest parliamentary assembly in the world. From Iceland, an exiled chieftain named Eric the Red led a group of settlers to an even more remote land he cannily named Greenland to attract followers. It was from a settlement in Greenland that his son, Leif Erikson, around the year 1000, sailed even further west, landing on the shores of what is now Newfoundland in Canada. He called it Vinland. The Norse settlement at Lanso Meadows is a tangible, archaeological proof that Vikings reached the Americas almost 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus, though their presence was short-lived, likely due to hostile relations with native populations and the sheer difficulty of supporting a colony so far from home. The Danes, situated at the gateway to continental Europe, primarily focused their energies on the rich but politically divided lands of England and Francia. Their raids evolved over time from smash-and-grab attacks to large-scale invasions and wars of conquest. In 865, a massive force, known in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. It was not a raiding party, but an army of conquest. Over the next decade, it systematically dismantled most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia all fell. Only the southern kingdom of Wessex, under the brilliant leadership of Alfred the Great, managed to resist the tide. After years of brutal warfare, Alfred achieved a decisive victory and forged a treaty that partitioned England. The north and east of the country became the Danelaw, a territory where Norse law and customs prevailed and where Vikings settled as farmers and traders. This long period of contact and conflict fundamentally reshaped England, profoundly influencing its language, place names, and political structure, and it was Alfred's resistance that laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England under the House of Wessex. In Francia, Danish Vikings repeatedly sailed up the Seine, besieging Paris on several occasions. In 911, the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, unable to defeat them militarily, made a strategic deal. He granted the Viking leader Rollo a vast tract of land at the mouth of the Seine in exchange for Rollo's conversion to Christianity and his solemn oath to become a vassal of the king and defend the kingdom from any future Viking incursions. This land became the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and these settled Vikings. The Normans would adopt the French language and Christian faith with astonishing speed, becoming one of the most formidable military and political forces in Europe. The third branch, the Swedes, also known as the Varangians, looked east. They were the river-farers, dragging their ships over long land portages to navigate the vast network of rivers that flowed through Eastern Europe, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They were known to the local Slavic tribes as the Rus. They were less conquerors and more long-distance merchants and mercenaries, seeking the silver dirhams of the Abbasid Caliphate and the rich silks and spices of the Byzantine Empire. They established fortified trading posts along the Dnieper and Volga rivers that grew into the first Russian city-states, like Novgorod and Kiev. According to the Russian primary chronicle, the Slavic tribes invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to rule over them, and his dynasty would govern the Kievan Rus, the precursor state to modern Russia, for centuries. The most elite of these Varangians traveled all the way to Constantinople, where their fierce loyalty and intimidating stature made them the perfect candidates for the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. A Varangian guard with their fearsome battle axes became legendary throughout the medieval world. The image of the bloodthirsty Viking warrior is not wrong, but it is incomplete. They were a people of profound contrasts. Their pagan religion, with its complex cosmology and gods like Odin, the god of war and wisdom, and Thor, the protector of mankind, glorified battle and cunning. But they were also shrewd traders, master craftsmen who created beautiful art, and poets who recited epic sagas of heroes and gods. They were governed by complex legal codes and a deep-seated respect for law and honor. Above all, they were adaptable. The Vikings who settled in foreign lands quickly assimilated. The Normans became French, the Rus became Slavic, and the Vikings of the Danelaw became Anglo-Scandinavians. By the mid-11th century, the Scandinavian homelands themselves had converted to Christianity and consolidated into the stable kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The explosive energy of the Viking Age had dissipated, but its legacy was everywhere. They had served as a violent catalyst, accelerating the formation of nations like England and France, creating the state of Russia and connecting the entire known world through their vast networks of trade and exploration, leaving an indelible Norse mark on the DNA and the history of Europe. In the wake of the Carolingian collapse and amidst the terrifying new waves of invasions from Vikings in the north, Magyars from the east, and Saracens from the south, the dream of a unified, centrally governed empire dissolved into a brutal reality. For the common person, the king was a distant, almost mythical figure, incapable of providing the most fundamental requirement of a state: security. The world shrank. Life became local. And in this desperate search for protection, a new political and social order was born, not from a grand design, but from necessity. This was the age of feudalism, a system that bound society together through a complex web of personal oaths in a world defined by violence. At its very core, feudalism was a profoundly personal and reciprocal arrangement. It was a contract sealed, not with ink but with sacred oaths between two free men of the warrior class, a lord and a vassal. The ceremony that bound them, known as homage, was steeped in symbolism. The vassal would kneel before his chosen lord, place his hands between the lord's, and declare himself to be the lord's man. He would then swear an oath of fealty upon a holy relic or the Bible, promising to be faithful, to provide military aid, and to offer counsel. This was no small promise. It was a pledge of loyalty unto death. In return for this pledge, the Lord would grant his vassal a fief. The fief was the economic engine of the entire system. While it could be a grant of money or an office, it was most commonly land. And this was not ownership in a modern sense. The vassal was granted the right to use the land, to collect its revenues, and to command its inhabitants. This income was essential, as it enabled the vassal to afford the staggering expense of being a mounted warrior, a powerful war horse, or destrier chainmail armor, a helmet, a shield, a lance, and a sword. The fief was what allowed a warrior to be a knight. This system created a vast hierarchical pyramid of power and obligation. A king, in theory, was the ultimate owner of all land in his kingdom. He would grant large territories, duchies, or counties to his most powerful magnates, his tenants-in-chief. These dukes and counts, in turn, would subdivide their lands into smaller fiefs for lesser lords, castellans, and barons. These barons would then grant even smaller parcels, perhaps a single manor or village, to individual knights who would be their household retainers. This process, known as subinfeudation, created a chain of loyalty that stretched from the king down to the humblest knight. However, the neatness of this pyramid was often a fiction. A knight might hold fiefs from two different lords who could, and often did, go to war with each other, creating an impossible conflict of loyalty. The King of England, for instance, was a sovereign ruler in his own island nation, but for his lands in France, such as Normandy or Aquitaine, he was technically a vassal of the King of France, a situation that was a primary cause of the 100 Years' War. Feudalism was a messy, decentralized, and often chaotic system that bred endemic private warfare, but it provided a measure of stability in an age that had none. If the knight was the pillar of this military structure, the peasant, or serf, was its foundation. The land of the fief was organized into manors, the fundamental agricultural and social unit of the age. The lord of the manor lived in a fortified manor house or castle, controlling the surrounding village and fields. The majority of the people who lived on this land were serfs. A serf was not a slave. He could not be bought or sold, but he was not free. He was legally bound to the land. He could not leave, marry, or even have his daughter marry without the lord's permission. In exchange for a small plot of land for his own family, a serf owed the lord labor's service, or corvée, working the lord's personal fields, the domain, for a set number of days each week. He also paid dues in the form of produce, such as chickens, eggs, or a portion of his harvest. He had to pay to use the lord's mill to grind his grain, the lord's oven to bake his bread, and the lord's wine press. It was a life of backbreaking, toil dictated by the seasons, with little hope of social mobility. Yet, in an age of constant danger, the manor offered a degree of security. The lord was obligated to protect his serfs from bandits and invading armies. Running parallel to this entire feudal structure was a second, even more powerful hierarchy, one that claimed authority not over the body, but over the immortal soul. The Roman Catholic Church. In a fragmented and violent Europe, the Church was the single institution that was truly universal, a spiritual kingdom that transcended all earthly borders. At its head was the Pope in Rome, the successor of St. Peter, who claimed supreme authority over all of Christendom. Below him was the vast clerical pyramid, powerful archbishops who governed entire provinces, bishops who controlled dioceses often aligned with old Roman administrative units, and at the bottom, the humble parish priest, the one church official most medieval people would ever see. The church's power was immense and multifaceted. It was a spiritual power, holding the keys to heaven and hell. The clergy administered the 7 sacraments, rituals that marked every stage of life from baptism, at birth to the last rites, at death. To be denied the sacraments was to be cut off from God's grace and condemned to damnation, a fate more terrifying than any earthly punishment. The Church wielded this power as a political weapon. For a disobedient individual, even a king, the Pope could issue a sentence of excommunication, making them a spiritual outcast whom no Christian was bound to obey. Even more devastating was the interdict. When laid upon a kingdom, it closed every church, silenced every bell, and forbade the clergy from performing most sacraments. The dead went unburied in consecrated ground, weddings were performed in the church porch, and the entire population was plunged into a state of spiritual terror. Few kings could withstand the rebellion this would inevitably cause. The church was also a colossal economic power. Through gifts from the faithful and bequests and wills from those seeking to smooth their path to heaven, the church became the largest landowner in Europe. Bishops and abbots were effectively great feudal lords, controlling vast estates, minting their own coin, and commanding armies of knights. The church also had its own system of taxation, the tithe, which demanded 1/10 of every person's produce or income, funneling immense wealth to Rome and local dioceses. Furthermore, the church held a near monopoly on education. Literacy was almost exclusively the domain of the clergy. They ran the only schools, staffed the nascent universities, and filled the ranks of the royal administrations as clerks and advisors, for only they could read and write. They were the keepers of knowledge, preserving the texts of the ancient world in their monastic libraries dot within the church itself. The monastic movement was a powerful force for reform and cultural development. Following the rule of Saint Benedict, which preached a disciplined life of prayer, study, and manual labor, ora et labora, monasteries became crucial centers of stability and innovation. Great monastic orders, such as the Cluniacs, starting in the 10th century and the Cistercians in the 12th, created vast, international networks of hundreds of monasteries, all answering to a mother house. They were often pioneers of agricultural techniques, clearing forests, draining swamps, and improving crop yields. In the quiet of the scriptorium, monk scribes painstakingly copied and illuminated manuscripts, not only preserving the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, but also the pagan literature of ancient Rome. This dual structure, a world of tears, defined the Middle Ages. Feudalism provided the military and political order, a society organized for war and defense. The Church provided the cultural and spiritual order, a society organized for the salvation of souls. For the medieval person, these two worlds were inextricably intertwined, one governing their life on earth, the other determining their fate in eternity. History is rarely shaped by a single day, but if ever there was a year that shattered one world and created another, it was 1066. It was a year of a dead king, a contested crown, and 3 ambitious rulers whose fates would collide in the fields of southern England. The events of 1066 did more than decide a royal succession. They ended the Anglo-Saxon era, which had lasted for 600 years, and forged a new hybrid nation with a new language, a new aristocracy, and a new destiny forever intertwined with the continent. It is the story of the Norman conquest. The crisis began in January 1066 with the death of the English king, Edward the Confessor. Edward was a pious but politically weak ruler who died without a direct heir, creating a dangerous power vacuum. The throne of England, one of the wealthiest and best organized kingdoms in Europe, was now up for grabs, and there were three main claimants, each with a plausible, if contested, right to rule. The first and most obvious choice was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. Harold was the most powerful man in England, an accomplished military commander and Edward's brother-in-law. He was English-born, acclaimed by the other English earls, and according to English custom, was elected by the Witan, the council of leading men, and crowned king the day after Edward's death. For the English, the matter was settled. But across the Channel in Normandy, another man viewed Harold's coronation as a perjury and a personal betrayal. This was William, the Duke of Normandy. William was the illegitimate son of a previous duke, a background that earned him the moniker William the Bastard. He had spent his entire life fighting to control his own duchy, crushing rebellious barons and invading neighbors, forging him into a ruthless, cunning, and exceptionally capable military and political leader. William's claim to the English throne was twofold. First, he was a distant cousin of the late King Edward. More importantly, William alleged that some years earlier, when Harold Godwinson had been shipwrecked on the coast of Normandy, Harold had sworn a sacred oath upon holy relics to support William's claim to the throne upon Edward's death. Whether this oath was sworn freely or under duress is unknown, but for William, Harold's coronation was a mortal sin, a violation of a holy vow that gave him a powerful justification for invasion, a justification he successfully sold to the Pope, who gave the Norman invasion his blessing and a papal banner to carry into battle. William began assembling a massive invasion fleet and an army of knights and mercenaries from across France, promising them land and riches in England. The third claimant was watching from even further afield. In Norway, King Harald Sigurdsson, known to history as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, was a living legend. He was a giant of a man, a battle-scarred warrior who had spent years in exile, serving as an elite mercenary in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. He had fought battles from Sicily to the Holy Land and had returned to Norway laden with immense treasure to reclaim his throne. Hardrada's claim to the English crown was tenuous, based on an old agreement between a previous king of Norway and a previous king of England. But for a man like Hardrada, it was enough. Seeing an opportunity in the succession crisis, he forged an alliance with Harold Godwinson's estranged and exiled brother, Tostig, and prepared his own Viking invasion, fleet to conquer England from the north. King Harold of England knew the storm was coming from two directions. He spent the summer of 1066 with his army, the elite Anglo-Saxon warriors known as housecarls, and the general levy of peasant soldiers, the Fird on the southern coast, staring out across the Channel, waiting for William's fleet. But the winds were unfavorable for the Normans. For weeks, William's ships were pinned to the French coast, By early September, Harold's army was running out of supplies and morale. The men of the Fyrd needed to return home for the harvest. Reluctantly, Harold disbanded his army. It was at this exact moment of vulnerability that news came from the north. Harald Hardrada had landed. The Viking fleet, over 200 ships strong, had sailed up the river Humber and landed near York. Hardrada and Tostig swiftly defeated the northern English earls at the Battle of Fulford Gate and took the city. When King Harold in London received the news, he acted with breathtaking speed and determination. He reassembled his personal army of housecarls and marched them north, covering the nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, gathering local levies along the way. He caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise at a river crossing called Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The Vikings, not expecting a battle, had left much of their armor with their ships. The ensuing battle was a brutal, bloody affair, a clash of two great warrior traditions. Legend holds that a single giant Norse axeman held the narrow bridge against the entire English army for a time before being brought down. In the end, English discipline triumphed. Harald Hardrada was killed, struck in the throat by an arrow, and Tostig was slain as well. The Viking army was so utterly annihilated that of the over 200 ships that had arrived, fewer than 25 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold Godwinson had won a stunning, decisive victory, securing his kingdom from the northern threat. But there was no time for celebration. Just 3 days after the battle, as his exhausted army was recovering in York, Harold received the news he had been dreading all summer. The winds in the Channel had changed. William of Normandy had landed his army at Pevensey on the southern coast, and was now ravaging the countryside. Harold's own personal estate. Once again, Harold acted with incredible speed. He force-marched his weary, battle-worn army south again. Another grueling 250-mile journey. He paused in London for only a few days to gather what fresh troops he could before marching to confront William. Against the advice of his brother to wait for reinforcements, Harold decided to force a battle immediately. He was confident in the strength of his army and their proven fighting ability. On the morning of October 14th, the English army took up a defensive position atop a ridge known as Senmike Hill, a few miles from the town of Hastings. They formed the classic Anglo-Saxon shield wall, a terrifying defensive formation of overlapping round shields and bristling spears, virtually impenetrable to cavalry charges. The Battle of Hastings began around 9 a.m. and lasted for the entire day, an unusually long duration for a medieval battle. William's army was composed of 3 main elements: archers, infantry, and his main striking force, the armored cavalry, the knights. The Normans opened the battle with a barrage from their archers, but the arrows had little effect, flying harmlessly over the high shield wall. William then sent his infantry forward, but they were repulsed by the disciplined English, who wielded great, fearsome battle axes that could cleave through a shield or a man with a single blow. Then came the knights. Time and again, the Norman cavalry charged up the hill, only to be thrown back in disarray by the unbreakable wall of shields and spears. At one point, a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that William himself had been killed, and a panic began to set in. William had to ride through his troops, lifting his helmet to show his face and rally them. The turning point of the battle came through Norman cunning. Noticing that some of the inexperienced English fyrd had broken formation to chase retreating knights down the hill, only to be cut off and destroyed, William turned this into a deliberate tactic. He ordered his knights to stage a series of feigned retreats, luring small groups of English soldiers to break the disciplined line of their shield wall. The tactic worked. The shield wall began to weaken and shrink as its numbers were whittled down. As evening approached, the battle reached its climax. King Harold was still fighting in the front rank, alongside his brothers and his elite housecarls. How he died is a matter of legend, famously depicted in the Bayeux tapestry. He may have been struck in the eye by a high arcing arrow, and then cut down by Norman knights who broke through the line. The death of their king shattered the morale of the English army. His brothers were also slain. The remaining housecarls, in a final heroic act of loyalty, fought to the death around their king's body. The shield wall was broken, and the battle was won. William marched on to London and was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. But his conquest was far from complete. He would spend the next several years brutally suppressing English rebellions, culminating in the infamous Harrying of the North, a campaign of scorched earth that devastated the northern counties and left tens of thousands dead from starvation. William replaced the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with his own Norman lords, who built hundreds of motte and bailey castles to dominate the landscape. The English language was demoted to the tongue of the peasantry, while French became the language of the court, law, and government for the next 300 years. The conquest fundamentally reoriented England, pulling it away from its Scandinavian connections and locking it into the political and cultural world of continental Europe, setting the stage for centuries of rivalry with France. The England of the Anglo-Saxons was dead. From the blood and iron of Hastings, a new England was born. At the close of the 11th century, a new and electrifying idea seized the heart of Christian Europe. It was a call to arms, an appeal that promised a unique fusion of piety and violence, a pilgrimage with a sword. It was the idea of a holy war, a crusade to reclaim the most sacred land in Christendom, Jerusalem, and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. This movement would unleash a torrent of religious fervor, greed, and brutality across the known world, and its first iteration, against all odds, would succeed in a way that seemed nothing short of a miracle to those who witnessed it. This was the First Crusade, one of the most unlikely and consequential military campaigns in all of history. The catalyst for this extraordinary event came from the East. The Byzantine Empire, the Christian heir to the old Roman Empire, was in a state of crisis. A new and aggressive power, the Seljuk Turks, had swept in from Central Asia. They had converted to Sunni Islam and had conquered Persia and much of the Middle East. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuks inflicted a catastrophic defeat upon the Byzantines, capturing the emperor and shattering the imperial army. In the aftermath, the Seljuks overran almost all of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. They now stood at the doorstep of Constantinople itself. Furthermore, their control over Syria and Palestine made the traditional Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a cornerstone of medieval faith, far more difficult and perilous. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, a shrewd and desperate ruler, sent envoys to the west in 1095. His appeal was specific and military. He needed professional, heavy cavalry, Frankish knights, to serve as mercenaries to help him push back the Turks and reconquer his lost territory. He likely had no idea what he was about to unleash. The emperor's appeal arrived at a moment when Europe was uniquely receptive. The papacy, under a series of reformist popes, had been growing in power and ambition, seeking to assert its authority over the entire Christian world. The current pope, Urban II, was a brilliant political strategist. He saw in Alexius's appeal a golden opportunity, a chance to heal the great schism that had split the Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, to channel the endemic violence of the European knightly class outwards towards a common enemy, and to place the papacy at the head of a monumental pan-European movement at the Council of Clermont in southern France in November 1095. Pope Urban II delivered one of the most influential speeches ever given. Addressing a vast crowd of clergy and nobles, he went far beyond Alexius's request for mercenaries. He painted a lurid picture of Turkish atrocities against Eastern Christians and pilgrims. He spoke of the desecration of the holy places. Then he made his stunning call to action. He called upon the knights of Christendom to cease their petty, sinful wars against one another and to turn their swords to a righteous cause. They were to embark on an armed pilgrimage to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ himself, from the hands of the infidels, and he made a revolutionary promise for those who undertook this journey, not for greed, but for the salvation of their souls. The Pope granted a full remission of all their sins. This was the plenary indulgence. A knight could now pursue his vocation of warfare not in spite of his faith, but in service to it. The path to heaven could be paved with righteous violence. The response was immediate and overwhelming, far exceeding Urban's wildest expectations. The crowd erupted in cries of Deus vult, God wills it. The message spread like wildfire across Europe, carried by preachers who embellished the Pope's message with their own apocalyptic fervor. While Urban had intended this to be a disciplined expedition of the high nobility, his call resonated with every level of society. Before the main armies of the knights could even be assembled, a massive, chaotic wave of commoners, peasants, and minor knights set off for the east. This was the People's Crusade, led by a charismatic preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Poorly armed, undisciplined, and with little understanding of the logistics required, they blazed a trail of destruction, famously carrying out horrific massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland, whom they saw as the enemies of Christ at home. When this great mob finally crossed into Anatolia, they were swiftly ambushed and utterly annihilated by a Seljuk army. It was a disastrous and bloody prelude. Meanwhile, the official crusade, the Prince's Crusade, was gathering. This was a far more formidable force, though it was not a unified army under a single commander. It was a collection of several great feudal contingents, each led by a powerful lord. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and respected duke from Lorraine, the ambitious and cunning Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy who saw the crusade as an opportunity for personal gain, and the wealthy and powerful Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, the oldest and most experienced of the leaders. After a long and arduous journey, these disparate armies converged on Constantinople. Emperor Alexios was horrified. He had asked for a few hundred knights and was now faced with a teeming host of tens of thousands of armed and hungry warriors camped outside his capital. He skillfully managed the situation, extracting oaths of fealty from the Crusader lords and a promise that they would return any formerly Byzantine lands they conquered to him, before quickly ferrying them across the Bosphorus into Asia. The Crusaders' first major test came at the city of Nicaea, the Seljuk capital. With the help of the Byzantines, they subjected the city to a lengthy siege, only to awake one morning to find the Byzantine imperial banner flying from the walls. Alexios had secretly negotiated a surrender to prevent the Crusaders from sacking the city. It was a military success, but bred deep suspicion between the Crusaders and the Byzantines. After Nicaea, they began the grueling march across the sun-blasted plains of Anatolia. They were tormented by thirst, starvation, and constant Turkish harassment. At the Battle of Dorylaeum, a vanguard force led by Bohemond was surrounded and nearly wiped out before the main army arrived just in time to crush the Seljuk forces in a pitched battle. The victory was crucial. It shattered the main Seljuk army and opened the way across Anatolia, but the cost was immense. Their next great obstacle was the legendary city of Antioch, a massive fortress that was once one of the great cities of the Roman Empire. The siege of Antioch lasted for a brutal 8 months, through a long, wet winter that brought famine and disease to the Crusader camp. Morale plummeted and desertions were rampant. The city finally fell, not to a direct assault, but to treachery. Woman made a deal with a discontented Armenian guard, who helped a small group of Normans scale a section of the wall and open a gate. The Crusaders poured in, and a horrific massacre ensued. But their victory was short-lived. Just 3 days later, a massive Muslim relief army from Mosul arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside the city they had just taken. Now it was the Crusaders who were trapped, starving, and seemingly doomed. At this moment of ultimate despair came a supposed miracle. A poor mystic named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had visions revealing that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, was buried beneath the floor of a church in the city. After some digging, a piece of metal was unearthed. Whether it was genuine or a brilliant fabrication, the effect on morale was electric. Filled with a renewed sense of divine purpose, the emaciated Crusader army marched out of the city and, against all odds, charged and routed the much larger Muslim army. The final leg of the journey was a grim march south to their ultimate goal. By the summer of 1099, a severely depleted Crusader army, perhaps only a quarter of its original strength, stood before the mighty walls of Jerusalem. The city was under the control of the Fatimids of Egypt, who had recently captured it from the Seljuks. The Crusaders launched a desperate assault. After weeks of siege fueled by religious ecstasy and a vision that urged them to march barefoot around the city, they launched their final attack on July 14th. Using siege towers constructed from wood brought from miles away, they assaulted the walls. The Genoese contingent managed to get their tower close enough for knights, including Godfrey of Bouillon, to get onto the ramparts. A gate was opened, and the Crusaders flooded into the city. What followed was a bloodbath of apocalyptic proportions, an act of savage religious fury that would stain the legacy of the Crusade forever. For 2 days the victorious crusaders slaughtered the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, men, women, and children in the streets, in their homes, and in the mosques and synagogues where they sought refuge. One chronicler wrote that his men waded in blood up to their ankles. Having achieved their goal, the Crusaders established 4 new states in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. The First Crusade was a shocking success, an impossible victory achieved through a combination of religious zeal, military prowess, and the political disunity of their Muslim opponents. But its triumph had unleashed powerful new forces and created a legacy of religious hatred and violence that would echo for centuries. No figure dominates our image of the Middle Ages more than the knight. Clad in shining armor, mounted on a powerful war horse, he is the central icon of the era, a symbol of martial prowess, noble virtue, and romantic heroism. This image, crafted in epic poems and courtly romances, presents a warrior sworn to protect the weak, uphold justice, and serve his lady. But beneath the polished steel and the silken banners lies a far more complex and often brutal reality. The medieval knight was the product of a violent age, a highly specialized killing machine whose existence was defined by warfare, and the code of chivalry he supposedly followed was as much a tool for social control as it was a moral compass. The journey to knighthood was long and arduous, beginning in early childhood. A boy from a noble family, perhaps as young as 7, would be sent away from home to serve as a page in the household of a powerful lord or a relative. Here he would learn the fundamentals of courtly life, manners, music, dancing, and how to serve at the lord's table. His formal education would be rudimentary at best. The focus was on practical and social skills. Around the age of 14, the page would become a squire. This was the true apprenticeship for war. The squire became the personal attendant to a knight. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's armor and weapons, caring for his hugely expensive war horses, and accompanying him in tournaments and on the battlefield. He would carry his knight's shield and lance, help him arm for battle, and fight alongside him, learning the brutal craft of combat firsthand. It was a squire's duty to protect his knight if he fell, and, if necessary, to drag his wounded body from the fray. If a squire proved his courage and skill, he would eventually be deemed ready for knighthood, typically in his late teens or early 20s. The knighting ceremony, or accolade, could be a simple affair on the battlefield, where a lord would strike the squire on the shoulder with the flat of his sword and declare him a knight. Increasingly, however, it became a lavish and deeply religious ceremony. The aspiring knight would spend a night in prayerful vigil in a chapel, confess his sins, and take a ritual bath of purification. The next day he would be dressed in symbolic, white and red garments, blessed by a priest, and would swear his knightly vows before being girded with his sword and spurs. This ceremony elevated the knight from a mere soldier to a member of a distinct international social class, a brother. In arms in the order of knighthood, the knight was first and foremost the medieval equivalent of a main battle tank. His power was based on the devastating impact of the couched lance charge. Riding a large, powerful horse bred for war, the knight would couch a long, heavy lance under his arm, turning the combined momentum of horse and rider into a single, focused point of impact that could shatter enemy formations and punch through shields and armor. This required immense skill and constant practice. The evolution of the knight's equipment tells the story of a perpetual arms race. Early medieval knights wore a conical helmet with a nasal guard and a long tunic of chainmail, thousands of interlinked iron rings over a padded garment called a gambeson. While effective against slashing attacks, mail was vulnerable to piercing weapons and blunt force trauma. Over the centuries, pieces of solid plate were added to protect vulnerable areas like the knees, elbows, and shins. By the 15th century, the knight was fully encased in a suit of articulated plate armor, a masterpiece of metallurgical engineering that made him nearly impervious to most weapons. This full plate armor, however, was incredibly expensive, costing as much as a small farm. Only the wealthy nobility could afford to be a fully equipped knight, reinforcing the exclusivity of the knightly class. When not at war, the knight honed his skills in the tournament. What began as chaotic, large-scale mock battles, or mallees, involving hundreds of knights fighting across the countryside, gradually evolved into a more ritualized and spectator-friendly sport. The joust became the main event, where two knights would charge at each other with blunted lances, aiming to shatter their lance on the opponent's shield or, for the most skilled, to unhorse him. Tournaments were a deadly serious business. Injuries and deaths were common, but they were also a place to win fame, fortune, in the form of prizes and ransoms for captured opponents, and the favor of high-born ladies. It was in the context of the tournament and the royal courts that the code of chivalry developed. Chivalry was not a formal written code, but a fluid set of ideals and expectations for knightly conduct, heavily promoted by the church and by courtly literature. It emphasized virtues like courage, prowess, loyalty to one's lord, generosity, and honor. A key element, popularized by the troubadours of southern France, was the concept of courtly love, where a knight would dedicate his deeds to a noble lady, serving her with a pure and chaste devotion. In reality, the application of chivalry was often highly selective. The code's protections and courtesies were generally extended only to other members of the knightly class. A knight was expected to treat a captured enemy knight with honor and ransom him, but he might feel no such compunction when dealing with common foot soldiers or peasants during a siege, where massacres were common. Chivalry was, in many ways, a professional etiquette for the warrior aristocracy, a way to regulate violence among themselves and distinguish their noble form of warfare from the savagery of commoners. The ultimate fusion of the knightly and religious ideals was found in the creation of the military orders during the Crusades. The two most famous were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These were organizations that combined the roles of monk and warrior. Their members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, like monks, but they were also elite. Heavily armed knights whose purpose was to defend the Christian states in the Holy Land and protect pilgrims. The Knights Templar, with their distinctive white mantles adorned with a red cross, became famous as ferocious shock troops and later developed into a sophisticated international banking organization, a source of their immense wealth and eventual downfall. The Knights Hospitaller, in their black mantles with a white cross, focused initially on caring for the sick and poor, but soon became a formidable military force in their own right. These warrior monks who dedicated their lives to both prayer and warfare in the service of God represented the chivalric ideal in its most absolute and militant form. For all its contradictions, the figure of the knight remains a powerful symbol of the Middle Ages. He was the product of a feudal system built on personal loyalty, the master of the medieval battlefield, and the flawed hero of a value system that attempted, however imperfectly, to impose order and honor upon a world of brutal violence. In the early 13th century, while the knights of Europe were fighting their chivalric wars and the popes and emperors vied for power, an unstoppable force was gathering on the vast, wind-swept steppes of Central Asia. It was a storm of humanity that would erupt out of the east with a speed and ferocity the world had never seen, forging the largest contiguous land empire in history. These were the Mongols, and their arrival at the gates of Europe would plunge the continent into a state of existential terror, leaving a legacy of destruction and awe that would linger for generations. The architect of this storm was a man named Temujin, born into the harsh and fragmented world of nomadic Mongol tribes. Through a brutal early life of betrayal, enslavement, and constant warfare, he systematically unified the warring tribes through a combination of brilliant military strategy, ruthless determination, and the creation of a society based on merit, rather than aristocratic lineage. In 1206, a great council, or Kurultai, recognized his supremacy, bestowing upon him the title of Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Genghis Khan then unleashed his newly unified people upon the world. They were not just a tribal horde. They were a disciplined, organized, and technologically sophisticated military machine. The Mongol army was composed entirely of cavalry, primarily horse archers. Every Mongol warrior was a superb horseman, trained from childhood to shoot a powerful composite bow with deadly accuracy from the saddle. This gave them unparalleled mobility. They could cover vast distances at incredible speed, choose when and where to fight, and shower their enemies with arrows from a safe distance, retreating before a counterattack could be launched. Their most famous tactic was the feigned retreat, where they would pretend to flee in disarray, luring heavily armored enemies like European knights into a reckless, disorganized pursuit, only to turn and envelop them in a prepared ambush. They were masters of psychological warfare, deliberately, cultivating a reputation for terror. They would often massacre the entire population of a city that resisted them, using the survivors to spread tales of their ferocity, encouraging other cities to surrender without a fight. They also excelled at siege warfare, a skill not typically associated with nomads. They would press captured engineers and laborers into service to build sophisticated siege engines like catapults and trebuchets, which they used to batter down the walls of the great cities of Persia, China, and Russia. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, who continued the relentless wave of conquest. The Western push, the invasion of Europe, was entrusted to his grandson, Baite Khan, but the true military genius behind the campaign was the legendary General Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's original and most trusted commanders. Subutai was a master strategist who had already led a reconnaissance mission that had skirted the Caucasus and defeated a combined Russian and Cuman army at the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223. In 1237, he and Bati returned with a massive army of some 150,000 warriors. Their first target was the collection of Rus principalities, the descendants of the Varangian Rus. The Rus princes were disunited and unable to mount a coordinated defense. The Mongols swept through their lands like a biblical plague. City after city, Ryazan Vladimir Suzdal was besieged and utterly destroyed, its population slaughtered. In 1240, the great mother city of the Rus, Kiev, a magnificent metropolis of churches and monasteries, was subjected to a ferocious assault. After its walls were breached by catapults, the city was razed to the ground, its people massacred. The destruction was so complete that a papal envoy passing through the area a few years later reported seeing nothing but endless skulls and bones littering the fields. The Kievan Rus was effectively erased from existence, and the remaining Russian principalities would live under the suzerainty of the Mongol Golden Horde for the next 240 years. With Russia subjugated, the Mongol army turned its attention to the heart of Christian Europe. In the spring of 1241, Subutai launched a devastating multi-pronged invasion. The main force, led by Bata, targeted the Kingdom of Hungary, while a smaller detachment, designed to act as a diversion and prevent reinforcements, swung north into Poland. The Polish force, a coalition of Polish nobles, Bohemian knights, and, most famously, a contingent of Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights, met the Mongol detachment at the Battle of Legnica on April 9th. The European knights, confident in their heavy armor and cavalry charges, proved no match for Mongol tactics. The Mongols used smoke screens to disorient the knights, employed their classic feigned retreat to break their formations, and then surrounded and annihilated them with arrows. The battle was a complete disaster for the European forces. The Mongols famously collected an ear from each slain enemy as a trophy, reportedly filling 9 large sacks. 2 days later, on April 11th, the main Mongol army, under Bati and Subutai, met the much larger Hungarian army, led by King Bela IV. At the Battle of Mohi on the banks of the Sayo River, Subutai once again demonstrated his tactical genius. He used a stone bridge to fix the Hungarian army in place, while secretly constructing a pontoon bridge downstream to send a force to attack their rear. The Hungarians found themselves trapped in their own fortified camp, which became a deadly, killing ground as the Mongols bombarded it with arrows and flaming projectiles. When the Hungarians finally broke and fled, the Mongol horsemen pursued them relentlessly for 2 days, cutting them down without mercy. The Hungarian army was effectively wiped out, and the kingdom lay defenseless. The Mongols rampaged through Hungary, capturing and destroying the city of Pest, before pushing on to the shores of the Adriatic Sea. By the winter of 1241, the Mongol armies were camped near modern-day Vienna. The terror in Europe was absolute. Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against the mysterious and seemingly invincible invaders from the east, whom they called Tatars, after the Greek word for hell, Tartarus. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, scrambled to raise an army. It seemed that nothing could stop the Mongol storm from sweeping across the plains of Germany and the vineyards of France, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And then, suddenly, they were gone. In December 1241, news reached Batu Khan from the Mongol capital of Karakorum that the great Khan, Gade, the son and successor of Genghis, was dead. According to Mongol law and tradition, all princes of the bloodline had to return to the capital. To participate in the Kurultai to elect a new great Khan, Baita and Subutai had no choice. They turned their armies around and began the long journey back to Mongolia. While Baita would eventually establish his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, on the Russian steppes, the full-scale invasion of Western Europe was never resumed. The death of a single man, thousands of miles away, had saved Christendom. The Mongol invasion was a short but terrifying shock to the European system. It revealed the tactical inferiority of the classic European knightly charge against a disciplined and mobile horse archer army. It exposed the weakness of a politically fragmented Europe against a unified and centrally commanded invader. The encounter left a deep psychological scar, a fear of the tatters that would persist for centuries. It also, paradoxically, opened up the world. For the next century, the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, secured the trade routes across Asia, allowing for an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. It was along these routes that Marco Polo would travel, and it was along these same routes that a far more deadly invader than the Mongols would soon make its way to Europe. In the middle of the 14th century, a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions fell upon the known world. It was an enemy that no army could fight, no castle wall could stop, and no prayer could appease. It arrived silently, invisibly, and it killed. With terrifying speed and impartiality, striking down rich and poor, pious and sinner, lord and serf alike, known to its horrified survivors as the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. History would remember it as the Black Death. This single pandemic would wipe out between a third and a half of Europe's entire population in less than 5 years, shattering the social, economic, and religious foundations of the medieval world and leaving a deep psychological wound on the consciousness of the West. The plague's origins lay far to the east, in the arid plains of Central Asia, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis lived among populations of rodents like marmots. The expansion of the Mongol Empire, with its vast, unified trade routes, had created the perfect highway for the disease to travel. Carried by the fleas on infected black rats, the plague spread along the Silk Road, reaching the Crimea on the Black Sea by the 1340s. Its arrival in Europe can be traced to a specific event. The Mongol Golden Horde was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa. When the plague broke out among the besieging Mongol army, they resorted to a terrifying act of biological warfare. They used their catapults to hurl the infected corpses of their dead over the city walls. The Genoese traders, horrified, fled the city in their galleys, taking the disease with them. In October 1347, 12 of these Genoese ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The townspeople who greeted them were met with a ghastly sight. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or dying, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The rats had already scurried ashore, and with them the fleas that carried the pestilence. From Messina, the plague spread with terrifying rapidity across Europe, following the major trade routes. It moved from Sicily to the Italian mainland, reaching the great port cities of Genoa and Venice. By January 1348, it was in Marseille. France. It then spread up the Rhone Valley into Spain, across France, and by the summer of 1348, it had crossed the English Channel. It moved north into Germany and Scandinavia, and east into Russia, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The disease manifested in 3 horrific forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. The victim would first suffer from a high fever, chills, and vomiting. Then, within a day or 2, painful swellings called buboes would appear in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes, from which the plague gets its name, would turn black as the tissue beneath died. This was followed by internal bleeding, which caused dark patches to appear all over the body, the symptom that likely gave rise to the name the Black Death. Death usually followed within a week. The second form was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the respiratory system. It was spread directly from person to person through infected droplets from coughing. It was even more deadly, with a mortality rate approaching 100%, often within just 1 or 2 days. The third and rarest form was the septicemic plague, which occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It was so swift and lethal that its victims often died within hours, before any of the characteristic buboes even had time to form dot to the people of the 14th century. The cause of the plague was a terrifying mystery. The leading scientific theory of the day attributed it to a miasma, or bad air, created by a malign conjunction of the planets, earthquakes, or poisonous fumes released from the earth. The medical advice was often useless. People were told to carry sweet-smelling flowers or herbs. The origin of the pocket full of posies in the nursery rhyme, to avoid bathing, or to ring church bells to disrupt the corrupted air. For the vast majority, the plague could only be understood as a divine punishment, an expression of God's wrath for the sins of mankind. This belief inspired desperate acts of piety. Great religious processions were organized, begging for God's mercy, though these crowded gatherings only served to spread the disease further. This religious terror also gave rise to the flagellant movement. Groups of men would travel from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes in a public act of penance, hoping to atone for the sins of the world and appease God's anger. Initially welcomed by the populace, they were soon condemned by the Pope as a hysterical, heretical mob that challenged the Church's authority. In the search for a scapegoat, suspicion and hatred fell upon Europe's Jewish communities. Vicious rumors spread that the Jews had caused the plague by deliberately poisoning the wells. Despite the Pope issuing decrees to protect them, pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague just like Christians, horrific pogroms were carried out across Europe. Entire Jewish communities and cities like Strasbourg and Mainz were rounded up and burned alive that the social fabric of medieval society completely broke down. The sheer scale of the death was impossible to comprehend. Chroniclers of the time wrote of cities where the living were scarcely enough to bury the dead. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands left their wives. Doctors and priests who tried to minister to the sick died in huge numbers. Fields were left unplowed, harvests rotted, and livestock wandered untended. The medieval world, with its rigid social order, was turned upside down. When the first wave of the plague finally subsided around 1351, Europe was a hollowed-out, traumatized continent. The consequences of this great mortality were profound and transformative. The most immediate effect was economic. With up to half the population gone, there was a severe labor shortage. This drastically shifted the balance of power between lords and peasants. Serfs who were previously bound to the land found themselves in high demand. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, and even freedom of movement. When lords tried to impose wage freezes and reinforce the old feudal obligations, it led to widespread unrest and a series of violent peasant revolts in the following decades. In many parts of Western Europe, the old system of serfdom withered away, replaced by a system of tenant farming and wage labor. The plague also triggered a deep crisis of faith. The Church had been powerless to stop the pestilence. Its prayers had gone unanswered, and its clergy had died alongside everyone else. For many, this undermined the authority and prestige of the institution. The psychological impact was immense. The art and literature of the late Middle Ages became obsessed with death and decay. With the theme of memento mori, remember you must die, and the danse macabre, or dance of death, which depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, from popes to peasants, to their graves, a grim reminder of death's impartiality. The Black Death did not end the Middle Ages, but it dealt a mortal blow to the old world. It accelerated changes that were already underway, cleared the way for new social and economic structures, and left behind a world that was both emptier and profoundly changed. As Europe was grappling with the horrors of the Black Death, its two greatest kingdoms, England and France, were locked in a protracted and brutal conflict that would span over a century. The 100 Years' War was not a single continuous war, but a series of conflicts punctuated by truces and treaties, lasting from 1337 to 1453. It was a dynastic struggle born from the tangled web of feudal loyalties, but it evolved into something far more significant, a national struggle that would forge the identities of both England and France, revolutionize warfare with the introduction of new technologies, and ultimately bring an end to the archetypal medieval age of the mounted knight. The roots of the conflict were deep and complex. Since the Norman conquest in 1066, the King of England had also been a major landholder in France. As Duke of Normandy or Aquitaine, he was a vassal of the French king, a situation that was a constant source of friction and humiliation for the English crown. The immediate trigger for the war, however, was a dynastic crisis. In 1328, the French King Charles IV died without a male heir, ending the direct line of the Capetian dynasty that had ruled France for over 300 years. The French nobility chose his cousin, Philip of Valois, to be the next king. But the English king, Edward III, had a more direct, though controversial, claim. His mother was Isabella, the deceased French king's sister. Edward asserted that the crown should pass through the female line to him. The French nobility, citing Salic law, which barred female succession, rejected his claim. For several years an uneasy peace held, but in 1337, after Philip of Valois confiscated the English-held Duchy of Aquitaine, Edward III formally declared himself the rightful king of France, and the war began. The early phases of the war were dominated by stunning English victories. thanks largely to a revolutionary weapon, the English longbow. Made from yew, the longbow was over 6 feet long and had a massive draw weight. In the hands of a trained English or Welsh yeoman, it could shoot further, faster, and with greater penetrating power than any other bow in Europe. An expert longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute, creating a veritable storm of steel that was devastating to both cavalry and infantry. The French, who still relied on a chivalric army centered on the mounted noble knight, learned the power of the longbow in a series of catastrophic defeats, at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. A small English army led by Edward III took up a strong defensive position. The French knights, arrogant and undisciplined, launched a series of brave but futile uphill cavalry charges directly into a hail of English arrows. The result was a massacre. The flower of French nobility was cut down, and the battle sent a shockwave through the European military establishment. 10 years later, at the Battle of Poitiers, the story repeated itself on an even more dramatic scale. The French king himself, John II, was captured on the battlefield, a humiliation from which France would take decades to recover. These victories proved that a well-organized army of disciplined common soldiers, armed with superior missile weapons, could defeat a larger feudal army of aristocratic knights. The war entered a new and even more brutal phase. With the French monarchy paralyzed, English armies, known as chevauchés, would rampage across the French countryside, burning crops, looting towns, and terrorizing the population in a deliberate strategy to break the will of the French people and discredit their king. For much of the late 14th century, France was ravaged by war, plague, and roaming bands of unemployed mercenaries who plundered the land. It seemed as though the English might actually achieve their goal of conquering France. After a period of truce and French recovery, the war exploded into its most famous phase with the ascension of the English King Henry V, ambitious and determined. Henry reinvaded France in 1415. His campaign culminated in one of the most celebrated battles in English history, the Battle of Agincourt. Henry's army, small, exhausted, and ravaged by dysentery, was cornered by a massive French army, perhaps 5 times its size. Henry chose his ground brilliantly, a narrow, muddy field between 2 forests that would funnel the French attack and prevent them from using their superior numbers. As at Crecy and Poitiers, the French knights, bogged down in the thick mud, were slaughtered by the relentless barrage of English longbowmen. The victory was total and stunning. Henry went on to conquer Normandy and much of northern France. By 1420, with the French reeling, he forced the mentally unstable French King Charles VI to sign the Treaty of Troyes, an incredible document in which Charles disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and named Henry V and his future heirs as the rightful successors to the throne of France. The 2 kingdoms were to be united under an English king, but Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving his infant son, Henry VI, as the titular king of both realms. The disinherited Dauphin Charles refused to accept the treaty and continued a desperate, low-level resistance from the south. By 1429, the English were besieging the strategic city of Orleans, the gateway to the Dauphin's remaining territory. The French cause seemed utterly hopeless. And then a miracle appeared. a teenage peasant girl from a remote village named Joan of Arc presented herself at the Dauphin's court. She claimed that she had been receiving visions from saints telling her that it was her divine mission to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king in the sacred city of Reims. In a state of desperation, the Dauphin gave her a chance. Joan, dressed in armor and carrying a banner, arrived at Orleans. Her presence had an electrifying effect on the morale of the demoralized French soldiers. She was not a commander in the tactical sense, but she was a powerful spiritual and inspirational leader. The French, filled with a new sense of divine purpose, attacked the English siege works and, against all expectations, lifted the siege of Orleans. This victory was a profound psychological turning point. Joan then led a whirlwind campaign, clearing the Loire Valley of English forces and escorting the Dauphin deep into enemy territory, to be crowned King Charles VII at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. This act legitimized his kingship in the eyes of his people. Joan's story would end in tragedy. She was captured by Burgundian allies of the English, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft by a corrupt ecclesiastical court. She was convicted and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, but her martyrdom only strengthened her status as a symbol of French resistance. Inspired by her memory, and with the newly confident King Charles VII leading a professionalized army, the tide of the war turned decisively. The French began to adopt new technologies, particularly gunpowder artillery, which proved highly effective at reducing the English-held castles that had dotted the landscape for decades. One by one, the French reconquered their territories. The final battle of the war, at Castillon in 1453, was a mirror image of Crécy. An English army was mown down by the fire from French cannons. With this defeat, the 100 Years' War was over. The English had lost all their possessions in France. Except for the small port of Calais, the war had profound consequences. It devastated France, but it also forged a new sense of national identity, a shared consciousness born from suffering and resistance. Symbolized by the figure of Joan of Arc, England, driven from the continent, began to develop its own unique identity as an island nation, turning its attention to maritime power. The war had also ended the military supremacy of the feudal knight. The victories of the longbow and the final triumph of French cannon heralded a new age of warfare, where common soldiers and technology, not aristocratic valor, would win the day. The dream of a shared Anglo-French monarchy was dead. In its place, two of Europe's great rival nations had been born. While Western Europe was forging new nations in the fires of war and plague, in the East, the ghost of the Roman Empire was breathing its last. For over 1,000 years, since its founding by the Emperor Constantine, the city of Constantinople had stood as the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. It was the queen of cities, a magnificent bastion of Christian civilization, a fortress that had withstood dozens of sieges, preserving the knowledge and culture of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. But by the mid-15th century, the empire was a shadow of its former self, shrunken to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. In 1453, This final remnant of the Roman world would face its ultimate test against a new and vigorous power, an event that would mark a profound turning point in world history, the fall of Constantinople. The empire's decline had been long and painful. The disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071 had lost it the Anatolian heartland. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, a monstrous perversion of the crusading ideal, had seen Western knights sack and occupy Constantinople, a blow from which the empire never truly recovered. Though the Byzantines recaptured their capital, the restored empire was weak, poor, and surrounded by enemies. The real power in the region was now the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were a dynamic Turkic tribe that had risen from the ashes of the Seljuk Sultanate. Under a series of brilliant and ruthless sultans, they had expanded relentlessly, crossing into Europe and conquering vast territories in the Balkans. By the 1450s, Constantinople was a Christian island in a vast Ottoman sea, completely encircled by the Sultan's domain. Its population had dwindled from a peak of 500,000 to perhaps only 50,000, rattling around in a city built for 10 times that number. In 1451, a new sultan ascended the Ottoman throne. He was Mehmed II, a young man of just 21, but he was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed by a single all-consuming obsession, the conquest of Constantinople. He saw the city, which the Turks called the Red Apple, as his birthright, the only fitting capital for his burgeoning empire. Previous sultans had tried and failed to take the city, but Mehmed was determined to succeed. He began his preparations with methodical and terrifying efficiency. To cut the city off from any potential aid from the Black Sea, he built a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus Strait, directly opposite an existing one on the Asian side. This fortress, Rumeli Hisari, or the Throat Cutter, was completed in just a few months and gave him complete control of the strategic waterway. Mehmed's most crucial preparation, however, involved the new technology of gunpowder. He sought out a gifted but greedy Hungarian cannon founder named Orban. Orban had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, but the emperor was too poor to pay his price. Mehmed offered him 4 times what he asked for and gave him a single task: to build the largest cannons the world had ever seen. The result was a series of monstrous bronze cannons, including the Great Turkish Bombard, a terrifying weapon nearly 30 feet long that could fire a massive stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds for a distance of a mile. It took 60 oxen to drag it into position and a team of hundreds of men to operate it, and it could only be fired a few times a day. But its psychological and physical impact on the ancient walls of Constantinople would be immense. Inside the city, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, prepared for the inevitable. He was a brave and competent ruler, but his resources were pitiful. He pleaded with the Christian powers of the West for aid, but his pleas fell largely on deaf ears. The Pope was willing to help, but only if the Orthodox Byzantines would formally submit to the authority of the Catholic Church, a condition that was anathema to most of the Byzantine populace, who famously declared, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's mitre." In the end, only a few hundred soldiers arrived from Venice and Genoa. The most significant contingent was a force of 700 elite professional soldiers led by a Genoese commander. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, an expert in siege defense who would become the heart of the city's resistance. The total defending force numbered perhaps only 7,000 men. They were to face an Ottoman army of over 80,000, including the Sultan's elite infantry, the Janissaries. The siege began on April 6, 1453. The great Ottoman cannons began their relentless bombardment of the city's legendary Theodosian walls. The triple line of fortifications that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. For weeks the cannons hammered away, reducing sections of the outer wall to rubble. But each night the defenders, men and women, would work tirelessly under Giustiniani's direction to repair the breaches with earth and barrels. The defenders fought with desperate courage. In the harbor of the Golden Horn they had stretched a massive iron chain across the entrance, preventing the Ottoman fleet from attacking the city's weaker sea walls. In a brilliant feat of engineering, Mehmed overcame this obstacle. He ordered his men to construct a greased wooden road over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata. Over a single night, his men physically dragged dozens of his smaller warships overland and into the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the chain. The defenders were now forced to man the sea walls as well, stretching their tiny force even thinner. Despite the overwhelming odds, the defenders held on for nearly 2 months. Several major Ottoman assaults were repulsed with heavy losses. Morale in the Ottoman camp began to waver. Mehmed, frustrated and angry, offered the emperor a final chance to surrender the city peacefully. Constantine XI refused, declaring that he would live or die with his city and his people. Knowing the end was near, he led a final, solemn procession through the city and received communion alongside his Genoese and Venetian allies in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, a moment of fleeting unity between Catholic and Orthodox in the face of annihilation. Nehmed ordered the final, all-out assault for the pre-dawn hours of May 29th. He threw wave after wave of his troops at the battered walls. The first waves of irregulars were driven back, as were the second waves of Anatolian troops. But these attacks served their purpose, to exhaust the weary defenders. Finally, Mehmed unleashed his elite, the Janissaries. In the heat of the battle, a critical blow was struck. A cannonball smashed into the charismatic Genoese commander, Giustiniani, mortally wounding him. His evacuation from the walls caused a panic and a collapse in morale among the defenders. At almost the same moment, a small group of Janissaries discovered that a small, little-used gate in the wall, the Carcaporta, had been left unlocked or was poorly defended. They poured through, climbed the wall, and raised the Ottoman banner. Simultaneously, other Janissaries overwhelmed the main defenses where Giustiniani had fallen. The cry went up through the city is taken. The final hours were a scene of chaos and slaughter. Emperor Constantine XI, casting aside his purple imperial regalia, was last seen fighting and dying alongside his last soldiers in the streets. A final heroic act that ensured his legacy. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder. A terrible sack ensued. Thousands were killed, and tens of thousands were enslaved. The great churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, were looted and converted into mosques. When Mehmed II finally rode into the city later that day, he was humbled by the destruction, but triumphant. He rode to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and sprinkled a handful of dirt over his turban in a gesture of humility before Allah, before declaring the great cathedral a mosque. The red apple had been won, but the fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave across the Christian world. It was the definitive end of the Roman Empire, a continuous political entity that had lasted for nearly 1,500 years. It established the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean and created a new strategic reality for Europe. The old trade routes to the east were now firmly under Ottoman control, a factor that would spur Western European nations like Portugal and Spain to seek new oceanic routes to the Indies, helping to launch the Age of Discovery. Many Greek scholars fled the fallen city, taking with them precious ancient manuscripts and a knowledge of the Greek language that had been lost in the West. Their arrival in Italy would give a significant boost to the burgeoning Renaissance. In 1453, the medieval world did not just witness the fall of a city, it witnessed the fall of an era. The 1,000-year period we call the Middle Ages drew to a close, not with a single event, but with a series of profound transformations that irrevocably altered the face of Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was a seismic shock. The end of the 100 Years' War in the same year marked the birth of modern nations. The invention of the printing press around 1450 would revolutionize the spread of ideas, and Columbus's voyage in 1492 would shatter the known boundaries of the world. By the dawn of the 16th century, the world of feudal lords, knights, and a unified Christendom seemed to belong to a distant, almost alien past. It became fashionable, particularly during the subsequent Renaissance and the Enlightenment, to look back upon this millennium as the Dark Ages, a long, stagnant, and ignorant interlude between the glories of Rome and the rebirth of classical learning. But this view is a profound and arrogant misunderstanding. The Middle Ages were not a pause in history. They were a foundational and dynamic era, a crucible in which the very institutions, ideas, and identities that would define Western civilization were forged. The most tangible legacy of the Middle Ages is the political map of modern Europe. From the chaotic migrations of the barbarian tribes, new peoples and new languages emerged. The kingdoms of the Franks, Visigoths, and Anglo-Saxons were the direct ancestors of France, Spain, and England. The long and bloody struggles for power, like the 100 Years' War, had the paradoxical effect of creating national consciousness. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of a particular lord, but as English or French, bound by a common language, culture, and a shared experience of conflict. Alongside the formation of nations came the birth of their essential political institutions. In England, the Magna Carta of 1215 established the principle that even the king was not above the law. The gradual evolution of the King's Council into a representative body, the Parliament, with the power to approve taxation, laid the groundwork for constitutional monarchy and representative government across the world. Similar bodies, such as the Estates General in France and the Cortes in Spain, emerged across Europe, establishing the tradition of counsel and consent between a ruler and the ruled. The medieval period was also the crucible of our legal traditions. The rediscovery of Justinian's Roman law in the 11th century revolutionized legal thought. Alongside it, in England, the development of common law, a system based on custom and judicial precedent rather than abstract codes, created a unique legal tradition that would be inherited by the United States and much of the Commonwealth. The Church, too, developed its own sophisticated system of canon law, which influenced everything from marriage contracts to the rules of war. This obsession with law and precedent was not a sign of darkness, but of a society deeply concerned with justice, rights, and the creation of a stable social order. Perhaps the most visible and awe-inspiring legacy of the age is its architecture. The Gothic cathedral is the ultimate expression of the medieval worldview. Soaring to unprecedented heights with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, these buildings were feats of engineering designed to draw the eye and the soul towards heaven. Their vast interiors illuminated by the divine light filtering through enormous stained glass, windows that depicted the stories of the Bible for a largely illiterate population, were meant to be a foretaste of the New Jerusalem. They were the collective effort of entire communities over many generations, a testament in stone and glass to the profound faith and ambition of the age. This ambition also drove an intellectual and educational revolution. Far from being an age of ignorance, the Middle Ages saw the birth of one of the West's most enduring institutions, the university. Beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, these new corporations of scholars and students became vibrant centers of learning and debate. Here, the great philosophical and theological questions of the age were rigorously examined using the method of scholasticism, a logical system of inquiry that sought to reconcile Christian faith with the newly rediscovered philosophy of Aristotle. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas and his monumental Summa Theologica created vast intellectual systems that attempted to synthesize all human knowledge. These universities created the very concept of academic degrees, established the curriculum of the liberal arts, and fostered the spirit of critical inquiry that would later fuel the scientific revolution. The era was also a period of crucial technological innovation. The heavy plow, with its iron coulter and moldboard, transformed agriculture in northern Europe, allowing for the cultivation of heavy, clay soils and leading to a significant increase in food production and population. The invention of the padded horse collar allowed horses to be used for plowing far more efficiently than oxen. The mechanical clock, developed in the 14th century, revolutionized the concept of time, detaching it from the cyclical rhythms of the sun and seasons, and dividing it into equal, measurable hours, a prerequisite for modern commerce and science. The invention of eyeglasses doubled the working life of skilled craftsmen and scholars, and the adoption of gunpowder from China would end the age of the castle and the knight, transforming warfare and the state itself. The late Middle Ages, with its terrible litany of famine, plague, and war, was undoubtedly a period of immense suffering and crisis. But this very crisis acted as a powerful catalyst for change. The Black Death shattered the old feudal bonds and empowered the common person. The 100 Years' War broke the dominance of the aristocracy on the battlefield. The fall of Constantinople shifted the center of gravity of the world. The medieval world was not a static, monolithic block of time. It was a period of constant, dynamic change. It began with the fragments of a fallen empire and ended with the rise of modern nations. It began with a world lit by a candle and ended with a world on the verge of circumnavigating the globe. It was an age of faith, but also of reason, an age of violence, but also of law, an age of darkness, but one that ultimately provided the spark for the light that was to follow. We have journeyed for 1,000 years. We have stood in the ruins of Rome and watched as new kingdoms were born. We have seen an empire rise and fall with Charlemagne, and felt the fury of the Viking longships. We have marched on crusade, too. The Holy Land witnessed the bloody reality of the Knights' charge, and trembled before the Mongol storm. We have survived the great Mortality, and heard the cannons roar at the fall of Constantinople. The Middle Ages are not a distant, dusty relic. They are alive in our languages, our laws, our borders, and our institutions. The soaring cathedral, and the humble parish church, the university campus, and the halls of Parliament, all echo with the legacy of this extraordinary time. It was an age of brutal contradiction, of profound faith and savage violence, of brilliant innovation and deep superstition. It was the age that built the foundations of our world. The past is never truly past, and in its shadows and its light, we can better understand ourselves. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the age of iron and faith. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments, which event or figure from this era do you believe had the most lasting impact on the world today? We look forward to reading your thoughts.